Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/VMSPod or paypal.me/VMSPod to make a one-time or recurring donation and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. I made it back from Frankfurt, safe and sound. It was a good trip as far as business goes. Didn't do much in terms of sightseeing. It's my fourth trip there. Frankfurt's not a very exciting city. So really, my goal was just stay awake all day Monday because I came in on a red eye that morning, crash at a reasonable hour, 2 days of conference, get to the flight Thursday morning, hopefully not get into any issues with the fact that Lufthansa was on strike Wednesday and Thursday. I was flying United, but you never know. And everything came off fine. Mission accomplished. Now, a week before that trip, the preceding Monday, I recorded this week's podcast with three-time guest Pete Bagge. We've managed to get together to talk about each of his recent comic biographies published by Drawn and Quarterly. In 2013 at Small Press Expo, we talked about his Margaret Sanger book, Woman Rebel. 2017, we did a live session at Cartoon Crossroads Columbus about Fire, the Zora Neale Hurston story. And now Pete has a new biography out from Drawn and Quarterly called Credo, about Rose Wilder Lane. Now, as someone whose entree to indie comics came with Pete Bagge's Hate comics in the late 80s and early 90s, along with Dan Clow's 8-Ball, Love and Rockets from the Hernandezes, etc., it's always a thrill to get together and shoot the breeze with Pete. Last time, like I say, it was for a live panel at Cartoon Crossroads Columbus. This time, one-on-one at his hotel in New York City. He was in town for an event celebrating the Book of Weirdo, a big hardcover about the influential indie comics anthology that was one of the first places where Pete published and where he wound up as editor, in between the editorships of Robert Crumb and Aileen Kaminsky-Crumb. All three of them were attending the Weirdo event. That was the idea, get all the editors together along with Drew Friedman and the guy who put together the book, John B. Cook. And this led to Pete saying, well, it turns out Bob and Aileen are staying in the same hotel as me, so I'll introduce you to them after we finish up. Since, as some of you know, Bob Crumb is on my Mount Rushmore list of guests, this was a thrill. Nothing was committed, but I'm hoping this leads to someday sitting down with each of them for a conversation. But back to Credo. This is the third and what looks like the final long-form comic biography from Pete, and it covers a subject near and dear to him, libertarianism. Rose Wilder Lane was one of the key figures in the development of libertarianism in the U.S. in the 20th century, and Pete goes into some detail as to how he discovered her and why she was so compelling a figure for him to write about. She really had a remarkable life, and Pete does a great job in Credo of capturing her development from misfit farm girl to newspaper columnist and world traveler, from socialist to libertarian, from gender conformity to however she chose to live. He also does a good job focusing on the relationship between Rose and her mother, Laura Ingalls Wilder, and strongly implies the role that Rose played in co-writing her mother's Little House on the Prairie books. And we get into that. We get into all this stuff during the conversation. Credo makes a great triptych, or slipcase, as Pete puts it, with his bios of Margaret Sanger and Zora Neale Hurston. And this will sound weird, but the shock value of Pete's really cartoony visual style being applied to what are ultimately serious biographies is worn off to the point where you can just appreciate Pete's storytelling chops and how he manages to distill some pretty significant and weighty lives into 72-page volumes, along with appendices with more material about them. It's a bummer that he's not going to be working in this particular mode for the foreseeable future, which we get into. But I'm glad he's got a route to publish his work and that he can continue working on biography for the figures that matter to him and to our country. Until then, give Credo a read and learn about someone who, as Pete puts it, walked the walk when it came to fighting for freedom. Just in general, I want to point out, this is a fun conversation. We go all over the place, and it's a hoot to me when I can just shoot the breeze with someone whose work meant so much to me at key moments in my life. So I want to thank Pete for letting me know he was going to be out in New York for the Weirdo event, carving out a couple hours to talk, and of course for introducing me to Bob and Aileen. Oh, and Brian Doherty, the guy who wrote Radicals for Capitalism, who was also visiting, and he and I got to talk right after Pete and I finished up. We're going to potentially do a show down the line, too. Now, as caveats go, air conditioning turns on and off a few times, so that creates some audio artifacts when I try to sample out the noise, and a couple of cop sirens. We're on the Upper West Side. It happens. Now, here's Pete's bio. Cartoonist Peter Bagge is the Harvey Award-winning author of the acclaimed 1990s alternative comic series Hate, starring slacker hero Buddy Bradley, and a regular contributor to Reason magazine. I should point out that Pete is the regular contributor, not Buddy Bradley. A graduate of SVA in New York City, Pete got his start in comics in the R. Crumb-edited magazine Weirdo, of which he later became editor. He has published 3 critically acclaimed books with Drawn and Quarterly: Fire, the Zora Neale Hurston story, and Woman Rebel, the Margaret Sanger story, along with the recently published Credo, the Rose Wilder Lane story. He lives in Tacoma with his wife Joanne, daughter, and 3 cats. And now, the 2019 Virtual Memories conversation with Pete Bagge. What drew you to Wilder, Rose Wilder Lane?
Rose Wilder Lane. Well, I discussed it in the introduction that I wrote for my own book. We're officially starting now.
Yes, we are officially started. Round 3 of
basically, I was reading this book called Radicals for Capitalism, which is about the history of the modern American libertarian movement, written by Brian Doherty, you'll be meeting. He's going to meet me here in a couple hours. So reading this book, it's mainly full of stories about and anecdotes about political philosophers. And philosophers, they tend not to be people who get out and mix it up. They still work and live in ivory towers, and what they know about life they're experiencing from behind their typewriter. And Rose Wilder Lane led a crazy life. So when I was reading this book, and when he got to talking about Lane, and when describing some of the hijinks she got caught up in, like almost getting arrested for like her run-in with this state trooper over a postcard she wrote.
Yeah. And potentially tax evasion for just trying not to make too much money. But,
and refusing to, and being poor on purpose so that she wouldn't have to pay income tax. When I was reading about that, I was like, this woman walks the walk. I thought 2 things. One is she's crazy, and 2 is like, this is fascinating. She doesn't just theorize, she did it. So that made me very interested in her. Started reading more about her. Before I read a word that she had ever written, I read a biography. There's only one full-length biography about her. And so that led me to reading her own writing, most of which is out of print. Some of it has been archived online. And I had never read Little House on the Prairie, which she secretly co-wrote with her mother, Laura Ingalls Wilder. I mainly avoided those books. I had always heard that they were good books, even for an adult to read, which is true. I finally did read them and really enjoyed them. I just was allergic to those books because of Michael Landon. I was allergic to that TV show, and it had everything to do with him. Yeah.
And you make the great joke about him in the appendix to this book also, with the picture of the guy who he's supposed to be playing.
That's right. Yeah, I couldn't stand him in Bonanza. couldn't stand him. There's just, for all I know, he's the nicest guy in the world. What do I know? There was just something about him. I was like, oh my God, this guy thinks he's so fucking cute.
And that's what turned you on to Wilder in general, or Wilder Lane? You just kind of...
Yeah, just very backwards way, just reading about... Yeah, it started with a political philosophy. And then it really didn't surprise me at all to learn that when she was young, she was progressive, a feminist. You could describe her as a feminist throughout her entire life.
Yeah.
Not like outwardly, stridently so, but I would probably describe her as straightly feminist in her youth. Mainly because she wanted to be a career girl and was ambivalent at best about the institution of marriage. I guess I should say she was openly hostile to the institution of marriage. But
based on a particularly shitty marriage.
And because of those beliefs, it seemed like it would fall into place that she also was a socialist. And pretty much almost everybody that... seemed to be a thinking person, with always the exception of Chesterton. Everybody before World War I that had half a brain was a socialist. And the instinct for believing in and putting your faith and trust into socialism had to do with the fact that the Industrial Revolution created a whole bunch of brand new problems. It solved some problems and made some things about life easier, but then there was a lot of unintended consequences as a result. And socialism provided a whole bunch of solutions. If you're a diehard socialist, it provided all of the solutions. So it's very easy to see why somebody would get behind that. Because you want to solve those problems. Yeah. Overpopulation and urban, people piled on top of each other in the Lower East Side. It's just unfathomable that this was being allowed to happen. But then, and Lane also wasn't the only person that just began to second guess, if not second guess socialism entirely, but started to second guess it as a solution to everything, was going to Europe, going to Eastern Europe after World War I, after the Russian Revolution, and then when the Soviets started to expand. There was another Eastman who also used, I think he started the magazine The Masses. He was one of the co-founders of it. Yeah. And so, of course, he was stridently socialist. And just like Lane, he also went to Eastern Europe just to see the glorious revolution in action. And he came back and went, nope. We've got some new problems we've got to figure out. He didn't become quite as anti-big government as Lane did. Lane just eventually evolved into a total anarchist. Mm-hmm. She's described as like one of the founding mothers of the American libertarian movement. And she also knew that it couldn't work. She knew that anarchism...
Yeah, you frame her as a minarchist in the introduction, right?
Yeah, minarchist, I guess that would be this...
As close as you get.
That's a relatively new term. It's only been recently that I've known a lot of people who describe themselves that way. So yes, I guess in practical terms you could describe her as a minarchist. But to her, anarchy was the ideal.
Sure.
Because to her, even if you have a tiny form of government, it will never stay that way. Government is like any living organism. It has to expand.
If you knew about my day job and some of the crazy shit that I have to do. We're involved in something now where the idea is maybe we could get the government to shrink this industry-funded program that we're involved in. And at which point everybody starts laughing because...
Right. Well, for one thing, if you're working in government, when you talk about shrinking anything, or that means... laying off somebody that you know. It's like somebody's going to get the axe.
I'll actually tell you because it's a story that I can share without it being anything horrible because it's part of the public record. This big government program that I helped negotiate, it has these 5-year increments. I got involved the second 5-year increment negotiating that one. So I wasn't around for the first one. The idea was industry pays in this money and this government agency hires 900 new people to do reviews of applications that industry is trying to get through. 900 full-time equivalents. So not necessarily 900 people, but, By the time I get involved, we're at year 4 of that first 5-year program, and they have hired 1,300 people because they underestimated how many people they would need to review all these applications. And when they report to Congress, it becomes, we exceeded our hiring goals. Oh. Yeah, see, in the private sector, we would be, you underestimated by 50% how many people you were going to need. You're fired. Get these people out of here. In the government, it's, we exceeded our hiring goals, and now we need another $150 million a year on top of everything else. Yeah, so I learned that pretty hands-on, but yeah, so the idea that government will always find a way.
Yes, it just
virusing
it is like a living organism, and it's expand or die.
Yeah,
you know, it seems like it takes some kind of a death, some kind of a trauma, like for example, what happened with the Soviet Union. It always seems like something really catastrophic has to happen to make it stop growing. Mm-hmm. You know. Not
that we're going, V for Vendetta like over here or anything like that. So that's. I just don't want anybody to think that we're planning a catastrophe.
Oh, no. Well, the thing is, if you don't keep it in check, it does lead to a catastrophe. You know, like right now, hardly anybody ever talks about how not only is our country's debt exploding, but that it's like exploding faster than ever under an allegedly Republican administration. Right. So and it's terrible. That will lead to a catastrophe, but it's almost like it's like you're staring at a massive wall. You know, you can't even see the edge.
There's no way to even begin.
People don't know how to talk about it. Yeah. They're like, okay, you say, oh, the debt's out of control. No, but everybody say, yeah, it is. But
I'm not going to do anything.
How about that World Series?
Now, do you see this one fitting? Do you see the 3 biographies so far fitting as a continuum?
Oh yeah. Well, I definitely see them as a boxed set.
Do you see a progression from one to the next?
Their formats are identical. They have the same page count. You know, I
saw a reviewer complain about that, who apparently has never seen a book contract before. Right. But
I'm not sure why that would.
Because people have to shit on everything on the internet. That's why. But but as far as
I could have made them there were little anecdotes, little asides that would have made for funny, interesting, entertaining pages. They all could have been 80 pages of art instead of 72. But it was suggested to me, possibly requested when I signed the first contract with Chris Oliveros to make the art 72 pages. I just went, okay. And it really helped me think about how to fully contain the subject's life, to include everything, to show their story arc, to touch on all the things that were important, what made them important, and also give you a sense of personality, not just their personality, but the personalities of the people who were really important in their lives. So the pages that I could have used but I didn't use, they would touch on things like that were already covered. Mm-hmm. They would be entertaining. You know, sometimes I regret not including certain pages. Like with Sanger, there was one page I would have, 2 pages actually, both involving her second husband, that I wish I included just because I found them very, amusing or telling. One was she put together a world conference on overpopulation. It was the first ever, and she was the main organizer. And she got all of these this was like in 1927, I believe, and it was held in Switzerland. And so all of these intellectuals from all over the Western world attended. All men, all white men, and her billing for this thing kept being reduced until she was no longer being billed as the person that actually whose the whole thing was her idea. So what I wanted to draw was, she was at the end, the conference was over, and what they wanted to do was take everybody's speeches, transcribe them, and then publish them, and send it out in a book, and she would reprint them in her birth control review magazine. And her husband actually was livid. He's like, these guys gave you no credit. Now they all bailed, and you're sitting here like their secretary, typing up, transcribing their speeches for them. She goes, I am outraged. And she goes, no, this is great. I'm glad to do this. And he said, how can you be glad? And she goes, because I am cutting out everything that all these men said that I don't agree with. So she made it seem like every single person that gave a speech was totally in agreement with her.
And I could see the husband's feet as he's flying off. That's a perfect feet bag moment.
And the other thing, too, that I wanted to show, I guess it would have been, actually, these are, now that I think of it, I should have included them. Maybe
well, I was going to say, you can do these extras in Reason. You can always do a 4-page follow-up.
Right, except that Sanger isn't libertarian enough for Reason.
Oh, there you go.
Since she wasn't a libertarian at all. Oops. Except that her cause gave people more freedom than any cause I could think of.
Right.
Not being a slave to your own biology. But the other story I wanted to show was her husband also prided himself as an efficiency expert. Mm-hmm. So he once went into her office, her organization's office, and redid everything. Just made it so that this file is here. So when you reach over here, you can grab that. Made it so that the secretary, here's your chair. Everything that you need, you could just swivel to it. And they'll go, okay, this is great. This really helps. But then he wanted to go through all the files. He wanted to re-alphabetize it, come up with, and they said, no, that's fine. You leave. And, the main reason at that point they wanted him to leave is because for legal reasons, they would keep on file the huge mountain of death threats that Sanger had. And they said, we don't want him to see how
you don't need to see that.
There are thousands of people that want to murder your wife.
Man. When you talk about the writing limits, I don't think we've talked about this in our past conversations. How do you structure the books? What is that? How much of the writing process versus the drawing process goes into that thing? Because I don't think we've discussed that aspect of it.
Well, first,
there's all the research.
Like all biographers, there's all the research, the teetering pile of books with the Post-it notes sticking out of them. And
but is the writing something where you're?
Yeah, well, I just get I do a rough outline, and with the rough outline, I'm at the same time breaking down the pages. Like, this will be a page, that'll be a page, and the stories are.
They do tend to be unitary.
Yes,
pages.
They tend to be, and they tend to also, unless something really tragic happens, they tend to end on a joke. Yeah. I can't help it. Everything has to be a joke. Yeah. So with all 3 books, there's only a few scenes that last more than 2 or 3 pages. So it's easy for me to break down the beats that way. It's like, right, and only every now and then would I think, okay, this aspect of this woman's life, I can't capture that in 1 page. I'll have to figure out how to stretch it into 2 or 3 pages. And I'm constantly changing my mind. It's like, okay, well, I'll toss this idea and I'll stick with this one. And I'm tweaking with it or right up to the bitter end, especially with Zora Hurston.
It's that's the densest of the 3, I felt. I mean, it had the most per page in a sense.
Yeah, and I thought that, she hadn't, when it comes to how much work she produced, how much she created to share with the world, she didn't create as much as the other 2. Certainly, Sanger is ridiculous, but Rose Lane was extremely prolific writer. Hurston wasn't quite that prolific. So, yeah, I thought that she'd be the hardest one to make a full-length story about, but it was the opposite. It was very much not what to include, and a lot of it had to do with, I guess in some ways, it'll sound like I was soft-pedaling her.
Yeah.
Because she would do and say things that, well, let's put it this way. If it was now and she was a straight guy, people would be apoplectic. I don't know how else to put it. She would I touched on it a little bit. But yeah, she had this whole scam going where she would take college jobs, but she always would take a college adjunct teaching job, under false pretenses. They would say, you're a published writer, you're a trained anthropologist, so we want you to teach either creative writing or an anthropology course. And she would agree. She'd say yes. So she'd be part of the English department, let's say. And then so there she'd have an English class, but then she would almost immediately start trying to talk the drama department into putting on one of her plays, one of her musicals. And then she'd wind up taking it over. And then the school is like, well, wait a minute, you kind of giving your writing class short shrift, and you're spending all of your time putting on this show, and you're recruiting the students who are free labor to put on the show. So it's all total self-glorification. Her hope was that it'll be so impressive that she'll be able to literally take it on the road and, work her way back to Broadway. Because she never got over the theater bug. She always wanted to do plays and musicals, like folk musicals. So she was doing that. The other thing she was doing, this is like she was in her 40s around this time, was relentlessly hitting on the male students and fucking a lot of them.
Yeah, nice work if you can get it.
Yes. And one really messy thing, I just talked about it a little bit in the back pages, is one of these students she married. And it was a real disaster. The marriage was a total disaster, although it was such a he said, she said. Her main biographer, Kristen's main biographer, had found the divorce records, and where they just
nightmare.
Of course, in those days you had to get a divorce, you had to
have real justification.
Yes, but usually, like one person, usually the guy would take the fall. He goes, all right, that's right. Yeah, I'm screwing whores. But with both of them, they both just dumped the judge with tons of complaints. And he said that she was practicing voodoo on him and gave him VD. And so I thought about writing about her relationship with that last son. And she claimed that he was physically threatening, and even more recently, since I finished the book, new letters arrived where basically, if there was such a thing, she would have gotten a restraining order against him. They just hated each other so much by the end. And but then I was like, this is just sordid, It's just, I feel like I was wallowing in the mud.
That's appendix notes,
Yes,
but not...
exactly. I go, this is just, it did show an aspect of her personality, but just at her absolute worst,
But how necessary was that for the sake of the story? But that sense of working in unitary 1 and 2 pages then makes it easier.
Well, for me, it just feels like a totally natural way to do it.
But also to be flexible with knowing that you have 72.
Right.
That, this is going to go on. If I focus on X, Y, and Z, it's going to go on too long. I could pull 2 pages of this and put in 2 pages. And it
allows me, with my Post-it notes on the biographies, be pointing to a certain paragraph, and I would just say, write about this. Just remind me, draw this guy. Make sure that you work this event in somehow. So when I would do that, when I would read like a paragraph, a scene would pop up in my head, and that scene would always work out into like a 1-page comic strip.
Trilogy, or you got more of these in the
No,
hopper?
that's too much work for not enough money.
Okay, we'll stick with 3 then.
Yeah, and I kind of knew it going in, and I became more and more aware of it as time was going by. That especially the Credo book, the Rose Wilder Lane book, that was going to be a tough sell for Drawn and Quarterly. The people who were like Drawn and Quarterly now at this point, like something I've been finding, they were super enthusiastic when they agreed to do the Sanger book.
Yeah.
But over time, because they're, especially younger staff members, they've told me that, like, for example, people were really uncomfortable or totally opposed to me doing the Hurston book just because I'm a white guy and she's a black woman. Like that, things like that shouldn't be allowed. And,
especially in Canada.
So, and then here I am writing about this crazy, radical.
I don't even know how we describe her. But
yes. Yeah. And she's not, everybody knows her mother, nobody knows her. When the whole time I was working on it, people would say, what are you working on? I'd say Rose Wilder Lane. They would say, who is that? I found out the hard way, the only thing I could say for them to latch on to is she's the daughter of Laura Ingalls Wilder.
Oh, Michael Landon. Yeah.
What was funny is they go, oh. And I was like, really? Just so why you don't ask me, why are you writing about somebody's daughter?
Yeah. And you haven't been attacked by the bonnet heads yet?
No, not at all, because the bonnet heads have they wound up, while I was working on that book, they wound up with
we should point out this is the Laura Ingalls Wilder fans who are irate that you would imply that her daughter co-wrote.
Yes, well, the original, the guy that wrote, well, I shouldn't say the original, the first full-length, regular, straight text biography of Lane, he was the first person to publicly say that this, to people will still debate forever how much of a collaboration it was, but he was the first to say publicly that
there's no way
Lane contributed heavily to Little House on the Prairie, the Little House books. And it's ironic that people would get mad, because if you look, you just have to go to the Herbert Hoover Library where all of their papers are, and the evidence is right in front of your goddamn face. The final drafts were neatly, perfectly typed. Not a single typo in them. Their editor, Ursula Nordstrom, she was like, she used to say, Laura Ingalls Wilder and E.B. White, they're the only people where I don't have to copy edit a thing. It arrives perfect. It just goes straight to the printer without one change. And that's just it. Rose Wilder Lane, throughout her life, has been an editor, a copy editor. And she was an excellent typist and very particular about never sending in anything that had one typo in it. And Laura Ingalls Wilder didn't own a typewriter.
You start to put two and two together.
Yeah. She wrote everything in tablets. Mm-hmm. You know, it was just those tablets that you buy at the drugstore and then send it to her daughter. And so, yeah, it was crazy that Wilder fans had a fit, because it's like, didn't any of you ever go to look at her archives? It's right there in front of your face. But of course, it ruined their idea of her, of Laura Ingalls Wilder being totally independent, somebody who doesn't need it, could take care of herself out there in the wilderness, pioneer woman. There's no way that she relied on her daughter. And people still will quibble. It depends on how invested you are in Laura Ingalls Wilder's legacy and image. They still will quibble and argue about just how much Lane contributed. Probably the best way you could describe it was that Lane was an extremely heavy-handed editor. But I would say 50-50. Yeah. And it sounds like it was 50-50.
A lot of people need strong editing. That's you know.
She did. Now, it's funny, too, how like the Bonnetheads also got mad at Lane, because towards the end of Lane's life, she I think it was still Nordstrom, she contacted her and said, I've got this, my mother died recently. I've been going through all of her papers. And there's a draft of a book that she wrote called Pioneer Girl. And she wrote it before the first Little House book. And do you want to publish it? And the publisher was like, yeah, new work from Laura Ingalls Wilder? Are you kidding? Of course we want to publish it. Everybody's going to go crazy. And the word got out that, this unpublished book by her is going to come out. People were going nuts. And then when it came out, everybody was like, what the fuck? This is so badly written. Well, just dry. It was just very, very dry. When you read the correspondences between the two women, Lane is constantly telling the mother of lift. You got to lift the story. You reach this point where, like I was complaining about earlier, like how these 400-page graphic novels, by page 50, I just have no motivation to turn another page. And that's what her mother's problem was. It's like, you got to build the plot, lift, keep the stories goes up. The story's got to go up. Yeah. And her mother could not get her head around that concept. So Lane always had to do it for her. She always had to put these elements together to keep the reader constantly turning the page, and not have it be, then this happened, then that happened, And
she ended up, inheriting the rights to, or the royalties to everything, but also kind of ignoring her mom's wishes about where they should go on after her.
Yes. Well, for people who are inclined to diss Rose Wilder Lane, they thought this was quite egregious because and they're probably right. Lane never talked about it, but it did say in her mother's will that the rights to the Little House books should go to the Mansfield, Missouri Library. And I'm laughing because
they've only got 3 books. Yeah.
Well, Lane was like, I don't even know these people. It's a bunch of old ladies. I moved away from Mansfield ages ago. These people mean nothing to me. How it sounds cute. That sounds really cute. It makes a great story that the cute little library from the town that she wrote all the books, that they would have the rights. And that's probably what her mother was thinking. I like those ladies. They're my friends. I'm going to give them the rights. And Lane had to have been thinking, what the hell are they going to do? What are they going to do with the rights? They don't have my experience dealing with publishing. And I don't think she thought too much about other medium. She dabbled a little bit with like one of Lane's own books was turned into a radio play. But I don't think she ever aggressively pursued movie. Yeah. Television didn't. Well, by then it did exist. But neither her or her mother ever talked about other medium. Of course, so then Lane, when she died, instead of giving it to the library, she gave it to her adopted grandson, who was a lawyer.
And future libertarian presidential candidate.
That's right. And Roger McBride was his name. And he was the one that, he maximized how much money you could make off of the Little House books. He did the right thing in that he turned it into a television show, and the television show made the book sales go through the roof. They always were popular. Their sales doubled and tripled once it was a TV show. So, and he became a millionaire in the process. So again, it's not a cute story that Lane took the rights away from the library, this little tiny small town library, and gave it to a lawyer who got stinking rich off of it. But that was the right thing to do. By turning it into a TV show, way more people read her mother's books. Yeah. And that's what she wanted. She wanted as many people as possible to read her mother's books. And so she did what you had to do to make that happen. The books might have been obscure forever if she left it with that library.
Now, what do you get better, or what have you gotten better at in terms of the research, writing, and drawing when it comes to this trilogy so far? Do you see things from when you first started out with those 3 books that, I wish I knew I could do this with telling a story?
Yeah, and it's just trial and error and practice is how to condense it, how to get the essence of these biographical figures. I had some practice going into this by doing little founding fathers.
Sure, you had the shorts that you were doing.
And I did a 12-page thing about a writer and editor named Isabel Patterson for Reason magazine. And once I did that, then I felt ready to do a full-length book. Something that I've been struggling with for as long as I've been a cartoonist and writing comics is to be more concise. I have a bad habit of being too verbose. And so just trying to whittle the words down to their essence.
Well, this one certainly feels like the least wordy.
Yes, and that's something I'm constantly working on. And I have to... Robert Crumb actually told me a long time ago that he became aware himself of how excessively wordy his comics were when he and Terry Zwigoff wrote a screenplay together. The Bigfoot girl, the Yeti girl, they actually were going to try to turn that into a movie. And to nobody's surprise, they had no luck. But working on a script, and he says, and Terry kept saying, you can't, with the movie, you don't want people just talking and talking and talking. You got to boil it down. And so writing for another medium helped Crumb think more economically, which was a good thing. And I had a similar experience the first time I had a development deal for one of my comics. It was the first of 2 times I tried to turn Hate into a cartoon show for MTV. And working on the pilot script, it was the same thing. I was working with a story editor, and she was just constantly
crossing everything out.
Always try to think. And it also, it makes it funnier. Like that old expression, brevity is wit. Just keep it short and tight, and that's what works the best.
Mm-hmm. And what did you learn about biography in particular? Both in terms of the biography you're reading and the act of actually trying to construct, figuring out those salient points.
One something that I thought would be a big problem, and I was very self-conscious of, is injecting too much of myself into this other person.
Yeah.
But first, like with all three of these women, to one degree or another, I relate to all of them.
I was going to say, there's a reason you picked them.
Yes. Their lives and their work resonated with me. But at the same time, I was always very self-conscious of injecting too much of myself. It's like, don't downplay things about them that you don't relate to or that you don't agree with. And don't build up or exaggerate aspects of them that I do relate to or I do agree with. But at the same time, reading other biographies and listening to biography podcasts, I've become really struck at how every biographer totally injects him or herself into their books. Like, I wish I could remember who said this. It's somebody famous, and I'm not giving the person due credit, but somebody once said, every book ever written is an autobiography. Yeah. And which is very true. And so that told me, don't worry about it so much. It's like, don't try to erase yourself. You know, it's that at the same time, that's fine. Currently, I'm doing, instead of doing these full-length ones, what I'm going to do for Reason Magazine is do regular short 4-page biographies, mainly about political philosophers from the past. So right now I just started working on one about Spinoza. Tough to do because this is an aside, his own writing, I can't get through one page. Yeah,
it's incredibly abstruse. Yeah. I was going to say, you're a braver man than I trying to tackle it.
This is flying right over my head. So I totally have to rely on other people to explain him for me. And so I took out 3 biographies. And they're all fairly recent. They've all been written like in the last 10, 15 years. Big, thick books. And I'm reading, as I'm reading it, it's like, oh, Jesus, I'm getting the feeling this woman is mainly writing about herself. And then so after 50 pages in, it's like, well, I'm going to just see if this other author will get less in the way. It's like, nope, this book literally reads
my
like an autobiography.
Yeah.
She is talking about her experiences in college, and I mean, she very much what resonated with her and Spinoza was Spinoza came from a very devout Sephardic Jewish community. And they had to run away from Iberia, avoiding the Inquisition. And were living in Amsterdam. So, of course, they had relative freedom in Amsterdam to practice their religion. But at the same time, it still was a very tight claustrophobic community. And so this one author, she grew up in New York, but also with a very, in a very conservative, I want to say yeshiva. Would it count as yeshiva? It's boys, right?
Yeah, yeshiva's the school itself. But yeah, it's for boys. I forget what the girls' version is.
So she went to a girls' yeshiva, whatever you would call that. And most of the book, she's talking about her own experiences, and every now and then remembers.
Oh, by the way, Spinoza.
He did. That happened to him too. And finally, there was one by a guy where it's like, I don't want to say it's the best. It's the driest, but he at least.
The most explicatory.
He tried the hardest to take himself out of it, but it had less personality than the ones. The first one I was reading, it was the newest one too. She's speculated so much about Spinoza's sex life, was imagining that he was a closeted homosexual, and with everything else I read about him, including these other biographies, there's not a shred of evidence.
Yeah, that's the thing. People try to just put that on everybody.
Right. It's like, and then when I read online, I read reviews of that woman's books, and they said, stop putting 2019 into the entire past.
Now, do you think at all, or has it occurred to you at all, of what it would be for somebody trying to do your biography? Yes, I only asked because I had this weird sleepless night. I wrote about it in the show, the podcast email a couple of weeks ago, where I had one of those can't sleep, having a Kevin Huizenga character sort of night, and thought, our lives are books. What if mine was a murder mystery? And what if somebody had tried to kill me? Who would be the suspects they would actually try to round up? Who have I wronged in my life? that you would actually try to think could be a potential murderer. So along those lines, when we think of our lives as books, do you imagine what it would be like for someone to try to do the biography of Pete Bagge? Or a murder mystery, but I'm going with a biography.
The first thing and the only thing that comes to my mind is I just don't know why somebody would want to. Yeah. I guess they would want to if they're particularly interested in my body of work, and talk about the work. But compared to like for example, those 3 women that I've done full-length biographies on, their lives were explosive. It was larger than life lives, and
you've still got time.
I know. I'm gonna start running around like a lunatic now. Now that my sciatica is acting up, it's too late now. I'm not going anywhere. So, that's half of it. With these, half of the reason I chose to write about these 3 women with these 3 books is well, first of all, the main half is I admire them and I admire the work they've done. But the other half, why I narrowed it down to them, is the lives they lived. It gives me something to draw. Yeah. Well, first of all, I guess when you say biography, you're talking about like straight text.
Comic biography.
Well, I had to think about comics. Yeah. I had to think, what am I going to draw?
Yeah, how to visualize.
It's like even to do like a short little 4-page comic for Reason. I made like a list of subject names and ran them by my editor. And she agreed with me for various reasons about who to write about, who not to write about. Like a famous libertarian minarchist philosopher was Murray Rothbard. Mm-hmm. And first of all, I have a lot of problems with Murray Rothbard's philosophy. I disagree with him a lot. I also think he was just talking out of his ass half the time, even though it sounded like he was convincing himself of this crazy shit. But the main problem is, he was like he was just like an agoraphobe. He was terrified to leave Manhattan Island. Yeah. The mere thought of crossing the George Washington Bridge just filled him with terror. Mm-hmm. So it's like, it would be page after page of a guy sitting behind a typewriter.
Or in your case, the guy, curved behind a drawing desk,
yes,
just scribbling away.
Yes.
So, yeah, is that what comes next? Is it essentially the 4-page bios, or are you thinking long form also for anything?
No, these 4, well, first of all, it's like the books, it's just too much work for not enough money. Mm-hmm. Reason, they're pretty generous with me with their page rates, so it's totally, even though there's still a ton of research, I still have these big piles of books, just didn't boil it down to these 4-page strips, but it's much more worth my while to do this new format with Reason. I'm glad they're willing to let me do it. I already have in the can, they just printed one about somebody named Lysander Spooner.
Mm-hmm. I know the name, but I don't know what he's known for.
He, mid-late 1800s. He was a lawyer by trade, even though he more often than not, he had all these causes. Anti-slavery, it was a big cause of his, but he literally started his own post office. Okay. At one point. What drove him out of business is he believed, and he was right, that the U.S. post office was gouging everybody. Stamps were really expensive back then. So it had to be like a real emergency to write somebody a letter across country. And he thought, no, that's too much. You could still charge like 2 cents and make a profit. And what put him out of business is then the U.S. government also started charging 2 cents. Yeah. So he's like, I was right.
It's competition.
I won. So yeah, he was a big supporter of John Brown, who tried to use force to free the slaves. And Lysander Spooner wanted to give John Brown his full support. It's just that all the other abolitionists no, that'd be the stupidest thing we could do. That'll be a disaster. After John Brown got arrested and before he got hung, Spooner tried to organize a rescue party.
Well, I was going to say that starts to border on the punch a Nazi.
Yes,
that we go through now. Is it okay to punch a Nazi or not? That's
right. So he was like, "Yeah, come on, everybody! What the hell is wrong?
Let's break him out of here."
Yeah, it was mainly Frederick Douglass that pleaded with him not to, because Douglas was like, I don't want to go to prison.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that. I don't want to go to prison.
Now, it's something I've brought up with a couple of guys in your era and a little bit younger, that question about working a full-length book versus either serial or, like you're talking about now, just not just, but doing shorts and eventually collecting those. You came up in an era of the pamphlet comic. Does the advance model work? I mean, you said in your case, the money's not good enough to do, full-length book by itself.
Well, something we were touching on before I think we were recording is there's a profit motive for publishers to make, not just to do hardcover square-bound books, but make them as fat as possible, because you can get away with the higher cover price the fatter the book is. Mm-hmm. So rather than publishers and editors trying to get these cartoonists to be more concise, to tighten their work, they're telling them the opposite. They have a financial reason to tell all these cartoonists to drag it out. I, of course, totally miss the doing the pamphlets. It's just that publishers say that, like, for example, Fantagraphics, with me belly aching, I stopped belly aching, but for years and years when this transition was happening, I kept bemoaning the disappearance of the comic book format, the magazine format, and switching to books. And they would always tell me the same thing, which was, go ahead and make a comic book. It's just that they're getting harder and harder to sell. Mm-hmm. So your royalties are going to be smaller. It's like we can only charge slap on so high a cover price. So they said it's just less money for everybody. But they said we don't say no to anybody that wants to do a comic book. But I've noticed that every now and then our cartoonists will insist on doing a comic book for the same aesthetic reasons that I want to, but they'll do one, maybe two, and they're like, you know what, this is
again, what's the money versus time
I'm not
equation?
making any money.
And with all you guys, it was one thing to do that in your 20s and early 30s. It's another thing when you're, you have families and mortgages, etc. I mean, the Bros are still doing, or they've gone back to doing the quarterly, comic magazine size, but still,
which still winds up becoming a book. The whole thing is to collect them and
right. The Strand is not having Jaime Hernandez in for a new issue of Love and Rockets. They're having him in for the trade paperback of Tanta and these other ones.
Right.
So that's what I'd sort of wondered, how that dynamic change, and you've experienced both sides of it with, again, doing pamphlets, doing full-length books with an advance.
Right. The first graphic novels I made two with Dark Horse and one with Vertigo. And at least the two that I did with the Dark Horse, they were miniseries. They were serialized, which I liked. I like the first part of, if I'm going to do this long story, if I'm going to do a novel-length comic, I like having part of it out there so that while I'm working on the second and third installment, I'm getting feedback from
I was wondering, is it the feedback side or the some of them it's just I want the money coming in while I'm doing the next part?
No, it's the feedback, and also when I see it in print, that tells me what's working and what isn't, and I can still make tiny little adjustments as I go along. It's like what seems I get a better sense of what's working and what isn't when I'm actually holding an issue in my hand while I'm still working out the rest of the story. Novelists used to work that way all the time. Dickens, everything was serialized before it came out as a novel, so he was getting feedback. That used to be the norm. Having Rose Wilder Lane, all of her novels were broken up were serialized in the Saturday Evening Post. So she also was getting feedback from the readers as she was continuing to work on it. And it's not like I'm dependent on the feedback, or anybody should. And a lot of the feedback is garbage. But every now and then, somebody would go say something. I was like, oh,
I get it. I can screw that up.
And the very first time I did a graphic novel that wasn't broken up was I did this one book for Vertigo called Other Lives, which has been out of print for a long time, but I'm going to get the rights back next year, and hopefully someone like Fanta will reprint it. But that was 128 pages. I'd never done anything that long, and it wasn't going to be broken up. And that drove me crazy, working on this, by far the longest story still that I've ever done. And it didn't appear in print until it was all completely finished. And the whole time I was working on it, that was just driving me crazy, not having it out there. I was so used to having something that just came out while I'm working on the next part of that story. So, I found that very troubling. But now I'm used to it. That's just the new normal.
Mm-hmm. Although, again, you prefer going to this, just for economic reasons, going to the shorter...
Yeah. Well, it's just...
you got a regular publisher there.
Yes, so. I'm lucky that I have this long time working relationship with Reason Magazine.
And I'm sure we discussed it in the first time we got together, 2015 or so, but where did libertarianism begin for you?
Well, I always was. When I was young, when I started asking more questions, like even of my parents, about things I'd see going on in the news.
Why can't we have our own post office? Sorry,
yes. Well, more social things.
Yeah, I know.
It would always come down to, like, generally I would see things the same way that my parents did. It's not like they were aliens to me, but, like, for example, I remember on the news they were talking about, I guess this was after Stonewall, they were talking about the gays are protesting, gay rights. They're talking about gay rights. And I was like 12, and I had an inkling, but I wasn't totally sure what gay meant. Yeah. So I remember my parents came home shopping and they were holding grocery bags. And as they came in through the garage, I said, "Mom, Dad, what does gay mean?" And they looked like they were just going to drop the grocery bags. And they started explaining. I was like, homosexual. That's what I thought. That's what I would stop freaking out. I know what that means. I just wasn't sure that gay meant homosexual. But then that led to, like, what's all this stuff with the rights and what's that all about? And my parents were ambivalent about all of that. And I remember thinking, what is there to be ambivalent about? I couldn't get my head around it that people didn't want adults to be gay if they were gay, that was like a bad thing. It's like my default point, and it was the same with, like, I remember first learning about abortion, and Roe v. Wade was in the news, and I asked my mother about it. And my mother was just basically, well, we're Catholic, so we're against it. It's murder. And, but I said, yeah, but they're talking about why they're giving all the reasons why it should be legal, and how can you argue with any of that? I mean, making it illegal, doesn't that cause way more problems than it doesn't solve any problem, first of all. Right. And my mother was just flummoxed. She just was saying what she believed. But my default position was always on the side of freedom, and it still does. It always surprises me when an issue comes up and I'm talking to somebody who I consider intelligent, and they're arguing against freedom, arguing against, or arguing in favor of bans, of prohibition, in spite of the fact that prohibition never works, of anything, of any product, anything. Prohibition never works. It always causes way more problems. Yeah. When you hear drug warriors talk about why drugs should be illegal, and the first thing they'll say is, it destroys lives, it destroys families. And that's why I always think, yeah, theoretically it could. I know a lot of people who do drugs, and their lives and their families are fine. Theoretically it could destroy a family. Arresting someone and sending them to jail, that definitely destroys a life and destroys a family. You're the destroyer, And to this day, it's like, I can't believe this is a conversation. And that has always been my default position on everything. And I'm always stunned when somebody doesn't see things my way. It's like, really? You really want to?
And this is why I think you need to bring Studs Kirby back as a character. I really...
Studs. Yeah, he was like my favorite character when I was younger, and...
I think he's the one who you could adapt into 2019 more effectively than others.
Actually, what happened was, do you remember Morton Downey Jr.?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
He was local around here, so...
Yeah, who had a TV show, and he was a crazy right-wing nut who had a TV show and insulted anybody that disagreed with him.
He was a proto-Jerry Springer and all that stuff.
Yes, and then after that, Rush Limbaugh became a national phenomenon. And here I was doing Studs Kirby, and I was like... These guys are bigger cartoon characters than Studs Kirby is. It's like, I can't satirize them. You can't. It's the same with, like, why Donald Trump is the death of comedy. You can't satirize him.
This is my...
If you're a comedian, just don't go there. Just know that your audience all hates him too. Yeah.
It's just cheap laughs for the audience. But I was stupid enough to say it.
But it's never funny.
Oh, no. You and I are pretty up to speed on that. No, I stupidly said to Tom tomorrow, a few months before the election, well, I guess it gives you a lot of material, not realizing just what a shitstorm, he was facing. That, and now it's, every 3 minutes there's another.
Right.
Whenever he stops doing the strip, it's just, for the week, it's just, okay, whatever happens after this.
Yeah. Well, in a comedy, one of his comedy specials, Patton Oswalt touched on it, where he said, with Trump, it's like, oh my God, can you believe what he just did and said? And he'll start saying to his friends, Trump, you know what Trump just did? You know what he just said? Well, and he says, and my friends will be like, no, shh, look at what he's doing now.
It's another thing. Yeah.
What you're talking about, that was the boring stuff.
Yeah, that was at least 5 minutes ago. Things are much worse. But yeah, it's again, not an age for that. But yeah, I was always figuring the Studs Kirby would have at least the ability to translate into the current.
Yeah, I don't. Boy,
touching on any of your characters.
Yeah, I'm not sure how I would make it work. Do
you have any, let's say, affinity for the old characters? And not yet, are you bringing Buddy Bradley back? But just the general, is it something where it was nice doing fiction? I'm enjoying doing reportage and biography.
Yeah, that. And I don't.
Do you look at doing more fiction, I guess?
I think about it sometimes. But the nonfiction stuff seems to, over the last 10, 20 years, it resonates more both with me and with the readers. Mm-hmm. It's like it didn't, even though I'm proud of like these graphic novels that I had done, they weren't hugely successful. I like them. I wish they were more successful, but the Sanger book in particular got a really strong response. It's got to be after like the hate stories, the hate collections, like Buddy does Seattle. It's got to be the best-selling thing I've ever done. When I go to a comic convention, I don't know why I don't bring more of them. It's the Sanger book, Woman Rebel. It will always sell out immediately, and it's mostly being purchased by women who come up to my table. I don't know if they're looking for it; they know that I've done it, and so they're looking for me only to look for that book, or they just simply are walking by, the title catches their eye, they go and look at it, and they'll buy it. And it's funny too; so many of these, and it is always women. They'll buy it, and they don't even look at anything else on my table. I guess it must all be repulsive to them.
Caricatures of Randy Johnson. Why would I want that?
So, and one time, recently I was at a comic convention in Denver, just recently. I thought I brought enough Sanger books. In an hour, they all sold. And the woman that bought the last one, I just said to her, all of that Woman Rebel, they sold out immediately. What's going on? And she just said, don't you follow the news? And I said, well, yeah, I do. And I go, but that's always in the news, the birth control business. I guess it was extra in the news that week.
Weird shit you've been asked to draw at conventions lately? Has there been any weird trends in terms of hey, Pete, would you draw?
You know what, that's...
You always get weird stuff. And
not lately. I haven't had any weird... I don't know if that was a fad, a trend, but I haven't gotten a really inexplicable request in quite a while. It's just basically I'm just drawing Buddy Bradley over and over and over again.
Again, for things you're best known for, that's it's a good legacy to have.
It's a something. Beats drawing nothing.
Yeah, that's again better to be wanted for murder than not to be wanted at all. But you're in town for the Weirdo anthology, or the Book of Weirdo, 3 editors thing. You were the middle editor between Bob Crumb and Aileen Kaminsky. Have you looked back on Weirdo as this book has come out, as this event is going on this evening? How much have you looked back on that time and your contribution?
Well, I'll probably touch on this at the Weirdo event, but it was something that I hadn't seen the Crumbs in decades, and we had breakfast this morning, and I reminded Crumb of this, of when I had already been editing it for a year or two, and for some reason I was convinced that I would be able to expand the readership. When I took it over, Crumb and Ron Turner, they told me how much it sold. It's been selling that same amount forever. Basically, you could describe the readers of Weirdo as Robert Crumb fans, period. Crumb, completists. And that's a set amount of people. And at least Ron Turner told me, I don't know how you could expand on that. And they were right. I never got, as hard as I tried, I would send promotional copies to anybody, not just the comic press, but even like the indie music press, anybody who might potentially write about it. But basically just, even if they did write about it, nothing translated into more sales. So feeling totally defeated, I remember complaining bitterly to Crumb about it. It's like, why are we banging our heads against the wall? Why am I? It's like, what do I got to do? And this just, the response to Weirdo is at best indifference and at worst open hostility. And I remember Crumb saying to me, maybe he was just BSing me just to cheer me up, but he said to me, he goes, Pete, don't worry about it. Eventually, at some point, the people will be throwing laurels at her feet over Weirdo, which made me laugh. Yeah. I go, well, it's like, I don't know if it's going to be that extreme, but I would always remember that as years would go by, and I'd think of Weirdo, but like decades went by. Everybody seemed to have forgotten about it. It was about 10 years ago when John Cook began talking about, at least writing something about Weirdo. It was originally just going to be a big feature in one of his comic art magazines. And he interviewed me and Crumb for a long time about it. And then he dropped the ball for a long time. So I just thought, well, there's that. But then he came back again. And here his credit all goes to John Cook, but I also want to give credit to Drew Friedman, who's been incredibly enthusiastic about this book coming out. And he did that great cover for it. But now here this book came out, and it's a John Cook, he couldn't have done more to promote it. He's so excited about it. It's like become this obsession. But now I have the opposite reaction when I look at the book, where I'm like, well, what the fuck is this? Why would somebody do this for a weirdo?
Nobody should throw laurels at our
Yes, yeah. Forget the laurels. So yeah, I do have funny mixed feelings about it. But to be honest, of course, I'm thrilled.
Yeah.
You know, it's great that this is all happening. Better late than never. Mm-hmm. You know.
And in the moment, did you guys see it as a counterbalance to Raw and the sort of
that was
art?
Yes, that was always part of it.
Art, but yeah, go.
Yes, and Crumb could speak more about that than me because he was the one that started it. Yeah. That was in my mind when I first saw Weirdo, because I was living in New York and I already knew Art Spiegelman and Francois. By that point, I had met them and I knew what Raw was all about. And I had very mixed feelings about Raw because I was uneasy with this deliberate attempt to cater to the fine art world. Yeah. You know, I was living in the midst of it. I went to art school in New York City, and which was like, in New York, it's like a behemoth. You know, it's just this. Yeah. It's a world that it's a racket and it's a genre, but the people who are into fine art, quote unquote, they don't think of what they're into as a genre, but it has its own set of aesthetics, it has its own language. People who are into fine art, they're interested in all of the fine art, and it just looks and smells like it. Just like somebody who's really into science fiction. They like that genre, and they like all the trappings of science fiction, and they'll at least consider any science fiction author. It's the same with the fine art world. And living in the middle of it, it felt, in going to art school, to me it was oppressive, the fine art aesthetic and the people who believed in it. They were such snobs. And so for this comic book to come out, and it was full of art and artists that I loved, but it was so clearly designed to appeal to these people that I hated that, of course, I had mixed feelings about it. So when I saw Weirdo, first of all, three things. One, it was Crumb. So yay, new work by Robert Crumb. Two, it had Robert Crumb's mailing address in it, even a P.O. box. But I was like, I can write to the guy, which I, of course, immediately did and sent him my own crappy comics. But three, when I saw it, of course, I was thinking, okay, this on some level, this has to be a response to Raw magazine. Because look at this crazy-ass garbage he's publishing here.
And you end up becoming the editor and publishing other people's crazy-ass garbage, too.
Right.
Was there any, holy shit, I'm the first guy to publish X, Y, or Z during your Weirdo time? Do you remember any sort of early sense of discovery, I guess?
It's hard for me to...
Like Fleener has a thing about, you finally, picking one of her things.
I'm pretty sure I was the first person ever to publish Fleener. And she was, she did this thing where I'm never quite sure, is this a submission or are you just simply, look what I drew? Because that's how she presented
well,
it.
Our conversations are like that too, but yeah, go on.
Yeah, she would, I think she started out, she would write fan letters and do some drawings, and I would like, her fan letters were funny, and her little drawings, her doodles in it were funny, and then like, she sent me this little comic strip. She goes, I just did this strip, and it was good, and I said, I want to publish it, I'll just stick it in the letters page. And she goes, oh wow, great, thanks, how exciting. I guess that was the first time she had something published, but again, there's just the way she went about it.
Yeah.
I'm still like, well, was that a submission?
Do I owe you anything?
Or, right. Was she hoping? Did she think I would? Or was she just like, look, just simply being palsy-walsy and, hey, look what I drew. But, yeah, there's her, maybe, I can't remember if it was me or Crumb that first published Dennis Worden. Might have been Crumb. I published something by Carol Leigh. I don't know if that was the first time she'd ever had, like, I mean, she already was a professional artist, comic artist. I don't know if that was the first thing she ever did totally on her own. A lot of these people, I can't remember if it was her first to them. It might have been other than like little mini comics, I'm pretty sure was the first person to publish, J.R. Williams. Yeah. Karol Mosiewicz, but who already was an established painter and printmaker, but first
insane. It just, those comics are absolutely nuts.
Yeah. She was fantastic.
Yeah.
It was not surprised, but as a fan, disappointed all the same that she stopped doing comics. Mm-hmm. But yeah, she was amazing. Right. I can remember she lived in Vancouver and I was in Seattle, so I would see her fairly often. She would be either up in Vancouver or down in Seattle. I got to know her pretty well. She posed for pictures when we were giving out the awards for the Ugly Art Contest. It's like me and her and Denny Eichhorn.
And that strip she did for Eichhorn. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. But I can remember on one of those strips when she came down, I published a comic that it was actually reprinted from Screw magazine. And it was this comic by S. Clay Wilson, and it was S. Clay Wilson at his S. Clay Wilsoniest. It was just completely over the top, filthy, violent,
blood drinking,
sexist, racist. But also the art was fantastic.
Yeah, it's Clay Wilson.
Yeah, and it was also like by S. Clay Wilson standards, it's like this is like the most beautifully drawn strip I've ever seen. Even though what he's writing about is
so hideous.
Well, it's what he always writes about.
Yeah.
So I was like, I got to reprint this. And I remember Karol Mosiewicz saying, well, I got a lot of shit for it. That was awful. She just read me the litany of why something like that shouldn't exist. And she says, I can't believe I appeared in the same comic book as that thing. And she goes, if you ever publish anything by that guy or anything like that ever again, I not only will never contribute to Weirdo again, I'll never speak to you again. And I said, okay. And then I published another S. Clay Wilson comic that was exactly the same. And again, it's like I'm probably some awful reptilian part of my brain did it for that reason. Like, don't tell me what to do.
I got the thought bubble of you with the Libra scales there.
Yes.
Wilson, do I go with
But the reason I published the other one is because it was really good. I thought it was really fun. I go, this is another great piece. It's like, I could not run this for all these other reasons, but it's like, I could run something else that's not as good.
Yeah.
So I published it again, and of course I thought she was just gonna have a cow, but she didn't say anything. I guess she realized then I was a lost cause.
Was there any sense of, I know it wasn't a golden age, but that sense that you were in the middle of something special in terms of everyone who was contributing?
Well, first there was this big wave of underground comics in the late 60s, early 70s. When I discovered those comics, I thought that was still going on. And I thought that not just Robert Crumb, but
Shelton and Moscoso.
Yeah, Gilbert Shelton. All my favorites were them and Bill Griffith, Kim Deitch, Aileen Kaminsky Crumb, Diane Newman, Robert Armstrong. I loved all of their comics so much. I just assumed they were all rich. I was just like, how could they not be rich? I think Dan Clowes told me the same thing. It's like, this stuff is so good that they gotta all be rich.
A friend said the same thing to me about you last week. I got as my witness, like, Pete, but I thought Pete could just write his own check at this point. I'm like,
everybody thinks I'm rich, except other cartoonists.
Right.
I hadn't seen Crumb in ages, and one of the first things he said to me is like, "How are you paying the bills these days? What are you?" Just knowing everybody's fucked, Why should I be any different? But again, people like myself and Klaus and the Hernandez brothers and Chester Brown, we were very inspired by all that first wave of underground comics. After a while, we found out the hard way that whole scene was pretty much dead, that hardly any underground comics were coming out anymore. And people like whoever existed, Ron Turner, Last Gasp, and Kitchen Sink, they were really not taking chances on any new artists. They would publish Bill Griffith and Crumb and practically no one else. So we were just self-published, and it wasn't just us. It was also like Matt Groening and Linda Barry and Charles Burns. Everybody started. They were inspired by those underground comics, but since there was no business model, there was no existing place for us to get our work published. Everyone was self-publishing, and there also was this explosion of mini comics that were just appearing everywhere. They discovered Kinko's and went nuts. So there was this. It was something that. And I really sensed it. I could see it, that this was going to be something big. So long as all these people I just named, if they all just keep drawing and keep getting better, how could this not explode into something new? And then lo and behold, you had this whole world of indie comics, alternative comics, which still exists. Which was it was like this weird echo. There was this weird gap between the original underground comic wave and then these younger people, roughly 10 years, 15 years younger, who were suddenly by the mid 80s turning out tons of stuff.
That's sort of like the gap between punk and grunge. You get new wave, but but really, the last gasp of rock and roll was punk, and then it's 15 years before you start getting the scene. So.
Yes, no, that's perfect.
Yeah, I feel smart for once.
I'm a smart guy. Yeah, so, there was a similar 10-year gap, and it was an echo. In many ways, it was an echo. Again, just like people saying in 1980, underground comics are dead. They're just dead. We're saying the same exact thing about punk rock in 1985. That stuff's dead. Especially people who always hated punk rock particularly enjoyed.
Yeah, of course. You
reminding me.
Kick dirt on its grave and all that. But yeah, and you managed to again, Crumb starts weirdo. You end up managing to keep the mantle going.
Yeah, and first of all, there were all these. I had friends in New York. Yeah. Some of them were already contributing to Raw, specifically Kaz and Drew Friedman. And
I went through the first and second pages and the last two pages, just headshots of all the contributors, to count how many of them I've recorded with at this point, which is a decent number, not super huge, but once I started to see, there's Drew, there's Josh, there's Kaz, there's Carol, Tyler, etc.
Right. So I was super eager to publish anything that they were willing to send me, and I did. And then over time, more and more people were sending stuff in, or not even sending stuff in. There was a lot of artists where sometimes I even had to twist their arm to let them republish something of theirs. Huh. It was something. I remember Linda Barry had a real problem with me when I wound up just reprinting a 4-panel, just one of her typical little Ernie Pook comics, and adding a plug to it. I wanted to do something more ambitious, but she had a big problem with it at the time. And the same with Raymond Pettibone, who now is like a hotshot fine artist, but he used to do, I would call it a mini comic. He wouldn't, but he did this thing called Tripping Corpse. Yeah. And it basically was gag panels, really dark humor. He was really inspired by the dark underbelly of the counterculture, the Manson aspect of the counterculture. Really dark humor, but hilarious. And I asked him, can I reprint a bunch of your... And there were gag panels, basically, drawings with captions. Yeah. And, he was polite, but he told me, I'm not a cartoonist. What I do isn't comics. I hate comics. I remember he wrote and told me, he said to me, the only cartoonist that I like at all is Justin Green. And I was like, really? So you hate every other cartoonist? Okay. And then, flash forward 20 years later, Best Comics of the Year collection comes out, and he did the cover. I was like, what was it? Latham was the editor. And I said, do you know your cover artist hates comics?
Because no, I'm a fine artist. That's sheesh. I did want to ask with the libertarian thing. There was one review of Credo that fears that you're becoming a one-note libertarian and risk becoming the next Steve Ditko, which in our world, I'd be perfectly fine with becoming. And I think, from your end.
Well, what is that one note? What one note is the person talking about?
Again, there's a degree that I don't quite get. Again, the fact that you include, I guess, Isabel Patterson and Ayn Rand in. And speaking of, there's no Ayn Rand biography coming from you.
No.
Okay,
Well, I'm ambivalent at best about her.
Yeah,
there are things about her and her philosophy that, of course, resonate with me, but she was...
There's fellow traveling parts of it.
You know what? It'd be an entertaining book. She was nuts.
Yeah, I think you'll find more humorous anecdotes of her, but again, all that would get taken out.
She'd be very easy to make fun of. But yeah, she was just... And it was weird. There was something very solid. There was like this base guiding principles to her belief that for the most part I would agree with and it would resonate with me. But then... from there, for example, if you were a fan of hers and started talking and saying, I really love your book and I really respond to your philosophy, I really love objectivism, but then you happen to say, I also like jazz and rock and roll, she would say, you don't get my work at all then. you are not that, you are history to me. You're nothing to me. You're dead to me if you like rock and roll. She was that's the same with if you like someone like myself, if you find ornate Gothic architecture beautiful and fascinating, you like to look at it and you admire it, and at the same time hate modern architecture, the straight steel and glass. Same thing. She'd be like, "Sorry, you don't understand my work at all.
Yes,
if you like gargoyles, then you don't get it." It was very much like it was totally my way or the highway with her. So obnoxious.
Which again, you could probably get laughs out of, but people would criticize you for laughing at something that we should be taking deadly serious and blah blah blah.
And also, that's her writing about her at such a third rail, because hardly anybody, I'm ambivalent about her, obviously, but hardly anybody else is. Most people either... everything she said is right, like Ditko.
Yeah. And
Ditko is one note in that sense because Mr. A, he's just spouting objectivist theory. Yeah, he's just...
while dropping people off of roofs. And,
Yes. And, and also Ditko was his own brand of crazy. He's very... he must have been autistic or high-functioning autistic. He had to be... the reason I said that with his artwork, when I'd look at his faces, like if a character of his was laughing, I'm like, this look... I don't think he ever looked right in the face of somebody who was laughing. This is a composite of a laughing face.
Always a look away look?
Yes, there is a real... this is it's like he looked at a guide that describes what face muscles do when somebody's laughing. I said, this does not come from him looking at a laughing face. Yeah.
So we don't have a Pete Bagge Mr. A special coming out anytime? Okay, that's
no. Yeah, Mr. A too, it's like I can't read it. It's on one level it's fascinating, his Mr. A comics, but also it's a little bit, what are you talking about? You're repeating somebody else's philosophy and you're not repeating it well.
Well, there's a guy, the same year you were at CXC, I guess last year, there was some guy I met who was talking about some big Ditko archive he was working on to produce some academic work. And I was sort of hoping it was the going off the rails Ditko. I was like, no, it's the later stuff. I'm like, oh, great. You have fun. I'm sure that'll be a very rewarding project for you. But now, is there anyone you wanted to publish in Weirdo that you couldn't get? Like someone you actually struggled trying to...
There were people who were...
Do you remember anything like that?
Yeah, sure. There was a handful of cartoonists where I'd be like, I was aware of them, but it never occurred to me for reasons that I can't recall of me not reaching out to them. Or maybe if I did, if they had expressed indifference, I just interpreted that as No.
Oh, that's like me.
That's kind of like Chester Brown.
That's like me and Charles Burns.
Oh.
He just kind of looks down and away whenever the show gets mentioned in front of him. So I've taken that as he's not interested.
Oh, okay.
I'm not going to, unless you want to, like you did with Chris Ware when you pitched him for me, which I thank you for because Chris did the show a few weeks ago. If you want to hit Charles Burns for me and work that out, let me know. But yeah, like Drew Friedman literally grabbed him once. You got to do Gil's podcast. And he just, I was like, okay.
Maybe he doesn't like podcasts.
I'm hip. I'm not going to stress it. I'm not going to be an asshole about it.
Yeah.
So,
When someone like him, like I think he probably felt like him and Gary Panter, they must have felt like they had a really nice home with Raw. And what did Weirdo and
was there any animosity or Sharks versus Jets when it came to artists falling on one side?
Well, because there were artists, but I didn't know. I barely knew Panter and Burns when I still was living in New York. I can remember it was like pretty much the same week that I was going to move to Seattle and leave New York. That same week, Gary Panter moved to New York, and I remember there was like. I guess it was a party for Panter, and that was the first time I ever met him, but then I was leaving.
He was literally the first artist I've ever met. I bumped into him at the Javits Center at the licensing fair back in 1996 when I was working on a trade magazine, and I just was walking up and down the aisles after finishing my interviews that day, and I saw Gary Panter, LLC. I was like, holy shit, Gary Panter! And he just, cringed as though I was, going to serve him papers or something.
He had a booth or something?
Yep. He was there at the licensing fair, licensing designs and such. And we just shot the breeze for like 4 hours that afternoon because I was 25, 26. And holy shit, the guy who does Jimbo. And that was, then I discovered how weird you guys really are. But anyway, that's.
Back to your question. Sorry, there'd be like somebody like. Chester Brown would be a really good example. I'll think back and it's like, why was he never in Weirdo? I mean, how did that happen? Was it a total lack of interest on his part that I never asked? I just can't recall.
Or it may have been he already has Yummy Fur and he's already doing his own thing. And
there was just like this 3-year window where I was editing it and then...
Or it could be your anti-Canadian bias.
And then... and then when Aileen started... publishing. I remember being jealous of her because by then the whole alternative scene was really exploding. Mm-hmm. And she published people that it's like, if I knew this person existed.
Yeah.
2 obvious examples would be Julie Doucet and Joe Matt. It's like, of course, if I was familiar with their work at all, of course I would have published it.
Yeah.
And a lot of other people that she published too.
And this is hearkening back to the last time we talked. We were at a live event at Cartoon Crossroads, Columbus. I just want to give you the opportunity to straighten the record out. We're talking about homeless people in Seattle, and you mentioned having to step over human excrement on the sidewalk. Some people took that as you referring to the people themselves as excrement. I heard it as excrement that was shat out by the people. But certain other, I can't believe he called people human excrement. I'm like, oh, I didn't hear it that way at all. Just so we're on the same page. You meant...
I meant poop that came out of human beings as opposed to dog poop.
Yes, and that's what I heard it was that. But certain peers of yours came up to me and said, I can't believe Pete refers to homeless people as human excrement. I'm like, you have a low opinion of Pete. Oh my God, why would you think he would say that? But good, I'm glad we got that.
Well, what does that say about them?
That was I think it's, one of those things where they fall back and I can't believe they'd say that. But last, and this could be a sensitive question if you want to avoid it. Memoir about your brother you referred to. Is that something you can talk about, or that you're interested in either pursuing or talking?
Well, I actually wrote it. I haven't drawn a line of it, but I wrote this entire script about. It's about my older brother who passed away over 20 years ago. It's really the story of me and him. It's the relationship of me and my brother. It's like I probably appear on more pages of this story than he does. And but for one thing, it's like I don't know who would buy it. I don't know no publisher is so thrilled. I mean, there are publishers that are interested in it, but none of them are going to give me much of an advance for it, which doesn't surprise me. And also I'm very, very self-conscious about it. My brother was troubled, and I worry about, he had a not great life, and so I worry about where to place the emphasis. I don't want to sugarcoat it, but I also don't want to drag his memory through the mud.
Yeah.
And towards the end, it was pretty fucking muddy. There's some aspects of things that he did and said towards the end that are pretty, like, not like he did damage. It's not like he killed anybody. It's not like he hurt anybody, but just his behavior was just, he was just consumed with self-loathing, and really didn't have much desire to live anymore. So I always suspect that he was a diabetic, but for the first 10 years of him having diabetes, he was good. He stuck to his diet, never drank, and but then over the last 10 years of his life, he was a raging alcoholic, which if you have type 1 diabetes, that's pretty suicidal. And but so it always, his death always, so he died suddenly, but it always, a part of me always felt like it seemed like a lazy suicide.
A progression of.
But something I only found out fairly recently. My brother-in-law was the first person to see his body. He lived in the same town, my sister's husband. And something he didn't tell anybody, didn't tell my sister until recently, is when the paramedics arrived, he told the paramedics, he's type 1 diabetic. This might have something to do with it. And after a while, the paramedics said, there's no insulin in this house. There's absolutely no insulin. Your brother-in-law clearly was not taking his insulin. So I said, okay, so it was a suicide. It literally was a suicide, And I found out that story only after I started writing this, which again, it just gives me pause. I also have 3 surviving siblings. And one sister, she's like, write whatever you want. I don't care. And another sister is nervous, is very self-conscious about, I don't want, worried about dirty laundry. I don't, I know that Doug wasn't perfect, but I still, how other people who didn't know him, he'd be perceived. Even though I was going to my parents were not going to play much of a role in this story. My parents are extremely complex and troubled people. And she was self-conscious about that. She goes, I don't want the world to know about this dysfunctional family grew up in, where they're crazy. And so I told her, it's like, you're much more worried than you should be. But meanwhile, my younger brother is just like, I don't want you to do it. He says, I can't stop you from doing it. If you're going to do it, you're going to do it. But I don't want you to do this book. So all of that gives me a lot of pause. I know, it makes me wonder about, like, Alison Bechdel. It's like, I'm sure she's discussed this in interviews, but it's like, what does her family say about the book she's written?
What do you think of Crumb with the documentary? You wouldn't know there were 2 sisters.
Well, he has one sister that, well, obviously, I guess his oldest sister.
Neither one appears in the documentary, or is even referenced.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, and the older sister, she's like, I want nothing to do with any of this. I don't want a thing to do with any of this.
Which is understandable. To me, I was 20 years old when I was in grad school, so maybe 22, 23 when that came out, and I'd been laboring under the belief that he was the shattered and warped one, and then you realize, oh, wait, he's the one who got out. Right. Okay, actually, and then, of course, after the fact, you find out there's sisters who have nice, normal lives. And,
right. Well, he had a very troubled younger sister who's now passed away. I think she died of cancer. She lived in Seattle. But there was a lot, especially when you see that Crumb movie, there's a lot of parallels between his family and mine. We have very, very similar backgrounds.
That does not bode well.
Well, it's just that, like, if you're going to make it a crazy contest, the Crumbs win. It's like they always, it's like, well, yeah, my family was like that, but not quite like that. Yeah. But even still, my younger surviving brother, he's aware of the similarities. He obviously saw the Crumb documentary, because when he wrote to me about this potential comic I was going to do about Doug, he's the sibling that doesn't want me to do the book. When he wrote to me, he says, so you're going to draw me eating string?
On that, I guess we should go meet Crumb. Okay. Thanks, Pete.
Sure, that was fun.
And that was Pete Bagge. His newest book is Credo, the Rose Wilder Lane story from Drawn and Quarterly. You should pick up all three of his biographies, Credo, Fire, and Woman Rebel, along with Pete's earlier work from Fantagraphics, like the Hate anthologies about Buddy Bradley, the Neat Stuff slipcase edition that came out, and, well, all of Pete's other stuff. And also check out his comics journalism and his shorter, like 4-page biographies in Reason magazine. The Lysander Spooner one just came out about a week before this episode. Now, as far as online presence goes, his old website is defunct, so it looks like your best bet to keep up with him is via Facebook at facebook.com/Peter Bagge Comics. And that's PETERBAGGE Comics, COMICS. He's on Twitter as Peter Bagge1, spelled the same way with the number 1 at the end, and on Instagram as PC Bagge. After we wrapped, I asked Pete, so, who you been reading? And if you want to hear his answer to that and get some extra conversation, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. I just posted the third quarter 2019 episode, and it features an hour of book recommendations and bonus conversation with Carl Stevens, Emily Nussbaum, Kate Maruyama, Laniers, Christopher Brown, Caleb Crane, David Shields, Dawn Raffel, Amor Tolles, Simon Doonan, Simon Critchley, and Sylvia Nickerson. You can support the Virtual Memory Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, a patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, my secret project about which more soon, I hope, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this at a hotel on the Upper West Side, so it cost $12 at the George Washington and about $35 at my favorite parking garage on West 96th. If you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee, or just toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. A special thanks go out to Nick Bartosik, Buzz Carter, Michael Hacker, Michael Janizik, Fred Kish, Annie Koyama, Jonathan Kranz, Kevin Katila, Jack Les Camella, Stephen Nadler, Barbara Nessim, Jim Ottaviani, George Fow, Payne Prophet, Dmitry Samarov, David Small, Stephen Solomon, Greg Tanner, Ford Thomas, Armando Veve, and Garrett Zecker for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories Show. We've got the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.